Okay, so in the second part of this, I'd like to talk about encryption schemes. So last time we talked a little bit about motivation and some of these basic primitives like one-way functions and pseudo-random generators and pseudo-random functions, and now I'd like to talk about how to encrypt data perfectly and then how to do it with computational assumptions in a private and public key setting. Okay, so just sort of as a quick reminder of what we did before lunch. So the setting again was Alice and Bob wanting to securely transmit data over a completely insecure channel, which is controlled by the eavesdropper Eve. We'd like to use one key to send many large messages. Ideally, we don't even want to have to exchange the keys in person. Potentially, at a minimum, adversaries can be quantum, but in general, maybe everything can be quantum, so the data, the algorithms, and so on. And again, we'd like to have some rigorous security proofs. So here's the sort of general picture again. So we have sort of this foundation of primitives, starting with one-way functions based on some quantum assumption, so about some assumption about the difficulty of quantumly inverting some function, and then from there we prove the security of various other primitives like pseudo-random generators, pseudo-random functions, and then on top of this foundation we build some schemes. Okay, so I just showed that this is sort of the picture for fully quantum cryptography, where we're trying to do sort of quantum functionality and use quantum data. And everybody has a quantum computer, and we want to be secure against quantum adversaries. Okay, but you can just as well think about the setting where only the adversaries are quantum. Okay, and just again a quick reminder of notation. PT stood for polynomial time classical deterministic algorithm. PPT was probabilistic polynomial time, still classical algorithm, and QPT was polynomial time quantum algorithm. And poly-n just means some particular polynomial function of n, and negligible in n means some function which is smaller than all inverse polynomials. So again, we started with this assumption that we have some quantum secure one-way functions, so it's easy to go from x to f of x, but it's hard to go from f of x back to x. And then we showed that if one-way functions exist, then pseudo-random generators exist. And again, a pseudo-random generator was something that expands n bits of perfect randomness into some larger m bits of pseudo-randomness, where pseudo-randomness means it, what it says in this equation. Okay, that for any polynomial time quantum adversary A, they can't distinguish the outcome from perfectly random. And then we also showed that from pseudo-random generators, one can build these more powerful pseudo-random functions, where if we fix this first parameter k, then the function that we get is something, if we fix this first parameter k to be something that's uniformly random, then the function that we get from n bits to m bits is oracle indistinguishable from a perfectly random function to quantum adversaries. Okay. And we talked about security against quantum adversaries for all of the above constructions, and we noted that in the case of PRFs, there's this choice between classical and quantum oracle access, which matters. So now let me sort of try to finish this sort of picture and talk about encryption. So first let's talk about perfect secrecy. So perfect secrecy of what? I guess encryption scheme. So this is also a private key encryption setting, but not a sort of computational assumptions one. So here we want to really show that no adversary, no matter how much computational power they have, can break the scheme. But in any case, so an encryption scheme here will consist of 3 algorithms. So remember, everything is an algorithm, so the key k should be generated by some efficient, let's say, classical algorithm. Then there should be another algorithm for encrypting messages with that key, and a third algorithm for decrypting messages with that same key. Okay, and for the moment, we just have this correctness requirement that if we start with some message, If we start with any message and any valid key, then encrypting and then decrypting should get the message back. Okay, so if Eve doesn't interfere, then the transmission is perfect. So implicitly here, we're assuming that Alice and Bob will share the key after the key generation algorithm is run. Just for naming, if you haven't seen these terms before, the message M is, before encryption is called the plaintext. The encrypted message is called the ciphertext. And note again that so far we've only required correctness. Okay, this notion that encrypting and decrypting is the identity. There's no security requirement yet. So I should say that I am sort of being intentionally ambiguous in the definition, so I haven't really specified what kind of polynomial time algorithms these are. I haven't said that M should be a classical string, or there should be a quantum state, or whatever. Somehow you should think of this definition as being rather flexible, and you can sort of plug in different things depending on what kind of application you're interested in, whether you just want to sort of transmit classical data in the presence of classical adversaries or quantum adversaries, or if you want to actually encrypt quantum data, for example. Okay, so you've probably all seen the one-time pad encryption scheme, but let's go over it again. So this is a scheme that has this perfect secrecy. So what's the one-time pad scheme? So the key generation algorithm just outputs a random string of n bits, so this n is sometimes called the security parameter. Then to encrypt a message M, we just add this key modulo 2. So what does this mean? Really, this means that we look at the bits of the key, and if the key has a 1 in some particular place, then we flip that bit of the message, and otherwise we leave it alone. Okay. And of course, this is additional modulo 2, so to decrypt, we just do the same thing again. And because Alice and Bob both have the key, they can do this. So if you haven't done this before, you should prove that this scheme is perfectly secret, in the sense that the ciphertext looks perfectly random to parties which are completely ignorant of the key. Okay, so this is what we mean by perfect secrecy. So long as Eve knows nothing about the key, the transmissions that she sees through her channel look like just perfectly random strings. And you should also check that if you try to use the same key twice to send 2 messages, then you will be able to extract some information about the plaintext. Okay, so it's perfectly, we have this perfect secrecy notion, but as soon as we try to send multiple messages, or even try to send messages that are longer than the key, then this security is lost. Okay, and then we have to pass to the computational assumption setting. Okay, so what about the quantum case? So can we one-time pad encrypt quantum states? So Anne mentioned this briefly in her talk. But let's first try and see what happens if you just try to apply the classical one-time pad to a qubit, okay, to a general state of a qubit. Okay, so one-time pad is just like applying the X gate, right? The X gate is just the not, right? It swaps 0 to 1. But there's a problem because this plus state that we saw before, the 0 plus 1 state is invariant under this operation, so it's not encrypted at all. Okay, the adversary can just plainly see that. So the problem here, from a certain point of view, is that we're not hiding phases, we're not hiding the coefficients. But we can sort of easily fix this by also with probability of half applying a z. So there's the z again, just like in Stacy's talk. It fixes 0, but flips the phase of 1. Okay. So really, we apply a uniform random element of this set of Pauli matrices, Ix, Y, Z, that you saw in previous talks. Okay, so I guess you should note that we needed 2 bits of randomness to make this choice, one to choose if we're going to apply X or not, and one to choose if we're going to apply Z or not. Okay, so here's the sort of a complete description, a more complete description of this quantum one-time pad encryption scheme. So what does it look like? So first, let's say that if I have 2 bits A and B, then P sub AB is just going to be the corresponding element of this set of Pauli matrices. Just pick some way of indexing them with 2 bits. Okay, and now to encrypt, now to generate keys, I need 2 n bits, as we said before. so twice as many as I have qubits. And then to encrypt an n-qubit state C, well, what do I do? For each qubit in the state, I pick two random bits, or I take sort of the first two bits of the key, K0 and K1. I pick a random poly based on those two bits, and then I apply it to the first qubit of the state. Okay, and then I do this for every single qubit. Okay, and the encrypting means just doing the same procedure again. Okay, so you should check the correctness of this scheme, and then you should prove to yourself that the ciphertext is actually perfectly random in this case, in the quantum case, to parties which are completely ignorant of K. Okay, so this is this perfect secrecy notion again, but now for encryption of quantum states. And again, you should try to show that if you use the same key twice, then you will be able to extract some information about the plaintext. So let's maybe talk a little bit about how you might prove this first exercise, the security of the quantum one-time pad. And I guess the first hint is that you should make sure you know how to do it classically. So you should make sure that you know how to prove that the classical one-time pad encrypts classical data. And then maybe from there it shouldn't be too hard to generalize to the quantum case if you think about it sort of in a certain way. And I think a natural way to think about it is using this density matrix formalism and using CPTP maps like in Serge's talk. So in the density matrix picture, we start with some n-qubit input state row. Okay? And now we're going to choose a uniformly random element of some finite set of unitary operators. Okay, so this finite set of unitary operators was one of these guys here. Okay, or if you want to think about just a single qubit, we're choosing a uniformly random element of this set. So you can think that U is this set, script U. Okay, so we pick a uniformly random element of this set, and then we apply that unitary operator to the density matrix row. Okay, so if you recall, in the CPTP map, formalism, instead of left multiplying our pure state by the unitary operator, we conjugate the density matrix, right? Because the density matrix looks like, well, in the pure state case, it looks like something like this, right? So then it should make sense that the corresponding, U applied to rho should look, something like this. Sorry, it's difficult to write this clearly. So somehow, so Serge talked about why this is the case. So, so in the case of the one-time pad, what we're doing is we're picking this unitary operator uniformly random from this finite set, and then we're applying it to an arbitrary input state row, and then what we'd like to say is that the state that comes out the other end has no information content whatsoever. Okay. This is the fully mixed state, okay, or classically it's just a uniform distribution. Okay, so whatever features this state had before, they're completely annihilated by this operation. Okay. So the first thing you should do, and I think this is a very good exercise, especially for sort of familiarizing yourself with the CPTP map and density matrix formalism, is to actually show to yourself that the Pauli matrices satisfy this property. Okay. Maybe just do it for one qubit, and then show how to generalize it. Okay, so this is just some small linear algebra calculation that you should make sure that you can do. Okay, so this property has a name, this general property that you have some finite set of unitaries, and if you apply a random element of that set, then you project to the maximally mixed state. Okay, this has a name, and it's called a unitary one design. Okay. So the formal sort of mathematical definition says that picking a random element of this finite set and then applying it, okay, so this is sort of what's happening here, is the same as picking a perfectly random unitary operator, okay, a Haar random unitary operator, and then applying it to your state. Okay. It says that these two CPTP maps should be the same. So what you should think, or sort of maybe the picture you should have in your mind is that the unitary group is some kind of complicated, or maybe not so complicated manifold, sort of like a sphere. It's not a sphere, but it's sort of like a sphere, like in this picture. And a one design is some finite set which sort of discretizes that sphere. And it does it in a sort of very nicely spaced way. And then you should, and then again, sort of continuing with this intuition, if you pick a uniformly random element from the sphere, from this sort of unitary group, then it should be fairly clear that applying perfectly random elements should sort of erase any features of the state. Okay, of course you have to sort of prove this, it's not so trivial, but you should be able to see that picking a uniformly random element with the unitary group and then applying it is projection to this sort of to the only sort of completely symmetric state, the maximally mixed state. Yes? That's right, the Haar measure, yes. So there's some measure, some invariant measure that you can define on the unitary group. It doesn't matter what it is exactly, but yeah, that's what I mean, the Haar measure. Good, so the idea should, of this one design should be that it has the same effect as this perfectly random unitary operator. So, these points on the unitary group are spaced just so that, again, picking a random one has also this effect of annihilating any features of the state. So, in fact, any one design, and not just random polys, can be used to encrypt quantum states perfectly. Okay. And this could also be called the quantum one-time pad. So there's one sort of problem with the one-time pad classically and quantumly that I want to talk about just briefly, and that's called malleability. So you probably know about this as well. Classically, so one problem with the one-time pad is that the adversary can simply flip the bits of the ciphertext. And this will have the effect of just flipping the corresponding bits of the plaintext. Okay, this just follows trivially from the way the one-time pad works. Okay, so in practice, if you sort of interpret these things in a certain way, this seems pretty disastrous. It means that some attacker could potentially intercept your bank transmissions and change the amounts. They could convince you to transfer them $10, and then they could intercept your message and flip a bunch of bits, and then you end up transferring $10,000 to them, or something like this. So the key point here is that they never have to decrypt your message. They don't know what the message is. Okay? Maybe they have some prior knowledge of what it is, but they don't know what the actual message is. But nonetheless, the ability to flip some bits of the message can be a very useful ability for them. Okay. So how do we sort of fix this issue? So let me just talk about this in the quantum case. There is a corresponding solution classically as well. And the solution is basically to randomize the state more strongly. So now you should think about picking a more fine discretization of the unitary group. And mathematically this means that if we pick one of the unitary operators from the set at random and apply its tensor square to our state, then that should have the same effect as applying a perfectly random or a Haar random unitary operator and applying its tensor square. Okay? So somehow here, what's happening is that we're not just emulating sort of matrix entries of this unitary operator, we're also emulating sort of squares, products of them. Okay, so this is some sort of second moment effect. So I won't go into the details. Let me just say that there is a nice example of a unitary true design which you've already seen, which is the Clifford group. Okay? And these are unitary operators which are generated by this gate set. Okay? So the Hadamard gate, this phase gate, and the control knot. So I think you've seen these gates in the previous talks, and I think maybe the Clifford group was also mentioned. So the Clifford group is extremely important in quantum error correction and fault tolerance, but in this case, it also provides for non-malleable encryption of quantum states. So this nice theorem, which I will only just sort of state informally, says that if we actually encrypt our quantum states with random elements of a 2 design, like for example, the Clifford group, like let's say we just generate a random circuit made up of these three gates, and then we apply that to our state. Okay. Then the effect is that the eavesdropper, Eve, cannot apply a non-trivial CPTP map on the plain text. Okay. So what does that mean exactly? Of course, I said before that Eve can just take complete control over the channel. Right? So she can do all kinds of stuff. What it really means is that if you compose encryption and then Eve's algorithm and then decryption, the effective map on the plaintext will be basically one of two things. Either the identity, so she just lets the state through, or replacement with some fixed state that has no relation to the input. Okay, so these are of course things that you can always do no matter how we encrypt. And the point here is that if we sufficiently randomize the state, then she can do no more. In particular, she couldn't do some kind of modification of the plain text, like with the runtime. Okay, so that's what I mean by non-trivial. I mean that the output of this combined map from plain text to plain text is some non-constant function. Okay, so that's sort of I think what I wanted to say about perfect secrecy. So now let me start talking about computational security assumptions and within the private key setting. Okay, so again, what is a private key encryption scheme? So this is more or less the same definition that I had before. Again, we have three algorithms: a key generation algorithm, encryption with some key, decryption with a key, and again, we demand correctness. Encrypting and then decrypting is the identity. Okay, but now what we'd like to do is we'd like to send multiple large messages with the same key. And now the question becomes, how do we argue about security? Okay, so before we had this sort of very fairly straightforward notion, we just said Eve gets no information. Eve just sees perfectly random states. So this is sort of very nice, very convenient to talk about, but in this case we can't say that because we know that we've given up perfect security, so we need some other notion. Okay, and basically there's two notions here which are basically the same as in the sort of purely classical setting. There's semantic security and there's indistinguishability. So semantic security, very informally, says the following. It says that regardless of the prior knowledge of the adversary and their goals, they cannot benefit from possession of the ciphertext. Okay. So we vary over all possible quantum algorithms. We vary over all possible sort of prior information that they might have. We also vary over all possible things that they might be trying to compute. And for all of those combinations, it should be the case that giving them the ciphertext doesn't help. So this is, I think, somehow a very natural notion. You've probably seen it before, and this really seems to say sort of what we want security to mean in practice. The other notion, which is much easier to use in practice, is called indistinguishability. So indistinguishability simply says that, in this case, quantum adversaries cannot distinguish encryptions of different plain texts. Okay. So they cannot distinguish encryptions of different strings or different states or anything. So I'll mostly talk about indistinguishability for the rest of the lecture. I should say that these two notions are equivalent, and you can prove this in basically all of the settings that I'll talk about. And this is, I think, quite nice because, as I said before, the semantic security notion sort of carries a lot of meaning, whereas the indistinguishability notion is kind of much easier to deploy in proofs. Okay, so let's talk about what indistinguishability means formally. So how do we sort of model this? And the typical way to do it is in terms of a game. And the game happens between a quantum challenger and a quantum adversary. And here I'm just going to talk about sort of the most general setting, and you can sort of plug in different variants as you like. Okay, so the first step is for the challenger to choose a key. And we should think about the challenger as sort of the party that's trying to keep their communications private, and the adversary is trying to break this key. So first the challenger chooses a key, then the adversary chooses some plaintext, okay, and sends it to the challenger. And now the challenger will choose a random bit and either reply back with the encryption of the message that the adversary sent, or with the encryption of 0. Okay, each with probability of half. Okay, and now A should output a guess, B prime, and we say that the adversary wins if B prime is equal to B. Okay, so if they correctly guessed, which choice the challenger made. Or, if you like, we say that the scheme is secure if the adversary cannot guess this random bit with better than negligible probability away from half. Because, of course, just some fixed choice or random choice will work half the time. Okay, so that's the sort of basic game. I guess I should say again, you should interrupt me if you have any questions at all. Okay, so as I said, this is a fairly flexible definition, sort of with some relatively basic changes. You can adapt it to sort of the purely classical setting, to the post-quantum setting, and to the fully quantum setting. So let's maybe look at a picture. And so this picture is sort of in the fully quantum setting, but I guess maybe it's not. I guess you can think about it in any way you like. So what's the picture? There are basically two scenarios. So sort of in the, I guess in the top picture is, B equals 0. So this is B equals 0, and this is B equals 1. Right, so in the top picture, in both cases, the adversary consists of two algorithms. The algorithm that happens before this challenge stage 3, and the algorithm that happens after. Okay, and so here we see that the adversary chooses some message and sends it to the challenger, and then the challenger either encrypts that message and sends it back, or discards it completely and then encrypts 0 and sends that back. So those are the two possibilities. And so, of course, the adversary is welcome to keep around some data about the plaintext or whatever else, and to carry it through until after the challenge along this wire here. And in the quantum case in particular, it's fine if, it should certainly be taken into account that the adversary can actually entangle these two registers before sending the message. And our scheme should, whatever scheme we have, it should certainly be secure in that case as well. Because this is something that is not possible classically, but that we need to take into account quantumly. Okay. So the question here is, so these two steps in the middle are what the challenger does, and the task of the adversary is to basically decide which of these two pictures happened to him. Okay, so that's the basic indistinguishability setup. So there's the picture again, and let me mention some strengthenings of this notion. And these are basically motivated by the possibility that the adversary could know something about the plaintexts that are being encrypted ahead of time, or that the adversary in fact has some partial control over the person doing the transmissions. Okay. So the first strengthening set is the so-called chosen plaintext attack, which says that the adversary throughout this entire game has oracle access to the encryption algorithm. So in particular, the adversary can generate polynomially many encryptions of messages, of whatever messages he likes. But nonetheless, when this challenge phase happens, he must still guess this bit. And there's a further strengthening, which is called the chosen ciphertext attack. And in this case, the adversary gets both this encryption oracle as well as a decryption oracle. But the decryption oracle is only prior to the challenge. Right? So you can think about sort of M here gets the decryption oracle, but D does not. So this strengthening number 2 is sometimes called the lunchtime attack, where we're supposed to imagine that sort of, we walk away from our computer at lunchtime and we sort of forget to lock it with a password or whatever, so somebody can come in and basically get complete access to our computer. They can encrypt as many messages as they like, they can decrypt as many messages as they like, but then we come back from lunch and we actually send some message with our secret key. And now they have to figure out what that message is. So that's sort of the, I guess, part of the motivation for the model. Okay, so then you might ask, this is sounds like an extremely strong definition. We've given quite a bit of power to the adversary. Can this definition actually be met? And it turns out that it can. And this is basically sort of the last step in this sequence, going from one-way functions through pseudo-randomness to encryption. Okay, so this is the scheme. And I'm sort of writing it in this sort of fully quantum setting, but okay, you can just as well replace things with classical wherever you like in order to get either the post-quantum setting or the purely classical setting. Okay. So what do? We start with a pseudo-random function, and then we pick a key. Okay, and the key will basically index the function, so it will fix the first input to the pseudo-random function. Okay, and now the encryption method is as follows. So first we're going to pick some, so we have some plain text C that we'd like to encrypt. So we pick first some uniformly random bit string R. Okay, and now, right, so we have this uniformly random string R. And now we're going to run this uniformly random string through the pseudo-random function. And then, based on the bits that we get out, we're going to apply the one-time pad, if it's classical information, the quantum one-time pad, or a two-design, let's say if we're trying to preserve non-malleability. Good, and so now this, this state you should think of as being randomized appropriately. And now the only other thing that we're going to provide as part of the ciphertext is this randomness string in the plane. So the entire ciphertext is this pair, the randomness that we generated, and this kind of randomized state. Okay, so the decryption algorithm should, at this point, I guess, be fairly clear. We just look at the first register, which will contain this classical randomness R, and then we can again run that randomness through the pseudo-random function. We can do this because we possess the key, and because the pseudo-random function is deterministic by construction, okay, or by definition, actually. So then, because the operation, p sub fk of R was unitary, we can actually undo it, okay, just by applying its inverse. Okay, so that hopefully demonstrates correctness of the scheme. And the claim is that this scheme is, in fact, chosen ciphertext secure. So in CCA secure. So let me talk a little bit about how you might prove this theorem, and you should. So the basic idea is to first prove that it's secure if you assume that p sub fk of R is perfectly randomizing. Okay, of course, we know it's not perfectly randomizing because it's controlled by a pseudo-random function, but for a start, prove that the scheme is secure in that case. And the next step is to show that if you have an adversary that breaks the scheme, then that adversary must have distinguished this pseudo-random function from a perfectly random function. So this adversary must have detected the pseudo-randomness that was used. So that's the sort of general strategy. And as far as this like CPA and CCA stuff, it helps to realize that each encryption query, so each query to the CPA oracle, corresponds to learning a pair R, Fk of R for a random R. Okay, so learning the value of the pseudorandom function at a random input. And each call to the decryption oracle corresponds to learning the output of the pseudorandom function at some input of your choice, or of the adversary's choice. Okay, and then sort of if you go back and look at the definition of a pseudorandom function, it should be fairly clear that these are sort of not very helpful things. In fact, they're not helpful at all for the adversary. So I think with these hints, it's relatively straightforward to prove this theorem. Good. So now for the last sort of few minutes, let me say a few words about public key encryption. And this is a case where essentially the same things that happen classically can also be done in the quantum case. So just in case you haven't seen the basic setup before, just sort of very, very quickly, we want all the stuff that we wanted before, but now we also want Alice to be able to send messages to Bob without exchanging keys first. Okay, and then by symmetry, we should be able to do the other direction as well. Okay, and the way to do this is for Bob to have two keys, one key which he sort of publicly announces to everyone, this public key pk, and then he keeps around some secret key sk. And then anyone, in particular Alice, can use the public key to send encrypted messages to Bob, but only Bob can decrypt with the secret key. So that's sort of the idea. So this is sometimes then called asymmetric key encryption because you decrypt with a different key from encrypting. And the private key case is called symmetric. Okay, so what is a definition, or a slightly more formal definition of what a public key scheme should be? So it again consists of three algorithms. Key generation now specifies a pair of keys, the public key and the secret key. The encryption algorithm encrypts with the public key, and the decryption algorithm decrypts with the private key. And the correctness requirement is just as before, encrypting with the public key and then decrypting with the secret key, assuming no interference from Eve as the identity. Security notions, basically we can develop similar ones to before. We can still talk about indistinguishability and semantic security. We can talk about CPA and even CCA. Okay. And the applicability is fairly general with some sort of straightforward modifications. Okay. So how do we construct such schemes? So actually it's not known how to do this with just the one-way function assumption. So we're going to make a stronger assumption, which is that we in fact have one-way permutations that possess trapdoors. Okay. This is exactly as it is in the classical case, in the purely classical case. So, let me give sort of you need quite a bit of detail to write down a formal definition of a one-way trapdoor permutation, so let me just give you sort of an informal sketch of what it is. So first of all, it's some family of indexed functions, which is, for starters, it has to be one way. But we need some additional properties. So first, each function in this family needs to be a permutation. We need some efficient algorithm for generating the index, okay, or generating an index. And this algorithm should also output some trapdoor secret T. There also needs to be an efficient algorithm from sampling from the domain of these functions, because they're no longer just n-bit strings like they were in the sort of standard one-way function definition. And finally, we need this trapdoor inversion algorithm, which takes a value of the function at an appropriate index I, and so long as we have the corresponding trapdoor T, we can actually invert the function. Okay. So, this sounds like sort of a whole mess of things to require. Do these things actually exist? So of course they do. So the classical case, of course, RSA gives some sort of trapdoor permutation if viewed appropriately, and there are also lattice-based quantum secure candidates. Okay, so you can look at these papers by Pikert and Waters and Gentry, Pikert, and by Kunten. So they give some constructions. So finally, let me sketch out how, if you have this trapdoor permutation, this rather powerful primitive, how you can get a public key encryption scheme. So, in the previous lecture, we saw how to start from a one-way permutation and build a pseudorandom generator. Okay, so we have that, so that's good. And now, for key generation, we're simply going to use the index trapdoor generation algorithm of the one-way permutation, of the trapdoor permutation, excuse me. So those are going to be our public and private keys. And now to encrypt, we're going to use the pseudorandom generator. Okay, so we're going to run the pseudorandom generator with random input, S. Okay, so recall here what the pseudorandom generator looks like. So, I used this sort of Goldreich and Levin construction here. So here, F here is the one-way permutation. Right, so as you recall, so the one-way permutation has some hardcore bit B, and we can evaluate this at the seed and then run the permutation over and over again to get more random bits. Now we can use the output of the pseudorandom generator to encrypt using the one-time pad or one design or two design, whatever we like, depending on our goals. So that's this operation here. And then finally, what we're going to output is the encrypted state, together with this sort of funny trapdoor device, which is the nth power of F evaluated at the seed. Okay. So why do we need that? Well, basically, so the decryption becomes possible. So in decryption, we just start from this nth power of F evaluated at S, and because the trapdoor allows us to invert from the nth power of F, we can compute all the pre-images. Okay, so we can compute all of these here, and then the hardcore bit, which is efficiently computable, we can compute as well, and then that allows us to undo the one-time pad that was here. Okay. So that's at least sort of correctness. Let me just sort of end with a slide about how to prove security of this scheme for the INCPA case. So the basic proof idea is, well, first you should prove the following lemma about encryption with pseudorandom generators. And this lemma says the following. It says that whenever you pick a uniformly random seed and then run it through the pseudorandom generator, okay, and then you have some bipartite state, row AB, and now you only encrypt, or you only randomize the first part, right? So these row sub G of S here are acting, so first of all, there should be an adjoint here. And these are really only acting on the A part. And we're doing the identity on the B part. So the thing you should prove to yourself is that if we do this, then this should be computationally distinguishable from having the maximally mixed state in the first register. So this is just sort of blowing away what's in the first register and leaving the second register alone. Now, of course, you're far from finished. Now you need some sort of hybrid argument again, which you'll have to adapt first to show the security of the pseudorandom generator, which you've sort of done already in a previous exercise. But now you have to show that even if you hybridize over this additional trapdoor device, then the argument still holds. Okay, so let me just sort of give a quick overview of what we talked about. We talked about the computationally secure encryption model. We started with one-way functions. We talked a little bit about some possible sources of quantum secure one-way functions, like the circuit quantum sampling problem. And then we showed how to build pseudorandom generators and pseudorandom functions from these quantum secure one-way functions. And then just now we talked about perfect security, how to encrypt with a one-time pad, a quantum one-time pad, even to do it non-malleably. And then we showed how to get private key encryption from pseudorandom functions, hence just from one-way functions, and how to get public key encryption from these sort of more complicated trapdoor permutations. And all of this was sort of in a fairly generic way, which works Classically, post-quantumly and fully quantumly, one has to be sort of careful about how you sort of write down the specific details, but morally the ideas that I talked about work in this setting. So let me end with what I think are some of the big open problems in this area. The biggest one, which is sort of in a much larger font maybe, is to find quantum algorithms for breaking known crypto systems. I think this is sort of by far priority number one. Right, so in particular by, let's say, inverting some of the one-way functions which are now believed to be quantum secure. Okay, like break necklace, break LWE. That would be very impressive. And very few people are working on this. Another thing you could try to do is get evidence that existing quantum techniques are insufficient for number one, for breaking these crypto systems. And there are some results in this direction, which basically amount to sort of certain lower bounds for generalizations of Shor's algorithm. Okay, so there's a paper actually about Mechelice, which shows that, which Martin I think briefly mentioned, which shows that sort of the very basic Shor technique wouldn't work against breaking, wouldn't work for Mechelice in a certain known code adversary model. So these kinds of results I think are very, very important as well. And again, very few people are working on them. Finding more cryptographic schemes that only work quantumly would be very exciting. So in addition to QKD, it would be nice if, for example, black box obfuscation was possible quantumly. It's not possible classically. And finding schemes for quantum versions of various classical things like fully homomorphic encryption, functional encryption, and distinguishability obfuscation. These are all sort of current research topics. So thank you very much.